She said I misunderstood. I said she misbehaved. And just like that, everything changed between us. The first time he noticed her, it wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic encounter, no lightning strike, but it was enough to make him pause mid-step. He was sitting in the corner of a quiet cafe, nursing a lukewarm coffee and scrolling through emails on his laptop. When she walked in, there was a calm confidence in her movements, a natural grace in the way she carried herself. She wasn't flashy, no over-the-top gestures or loud presence, but the subtle sway of her posture, the quiet warmth in her smile, demanded attention without asking for it. He thought it was the way she held herself, poised yet approachable, that drew his gaze. Maybe it was her laugh, soft but genuine, that carried just enough amusement to make the corners of his chest tighten with unexpected curiosity. Or maybe it was the way her eyes scanned the room with calm observation, taking in small details he usually overlooked. Whatever it was, there was something magnetic in her presence, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like an intruder in a world he secretly wanted to be a part of. Their first interaction wasn't intentional. She reached for the last almond croissant at the counter, and he had it in mind for himself. A quiet pause, a slight furrow in her brow, and a subtle smirk passed between them. "Oh, you were going to get this?" she asked, her tone teasing but light. "I thought I saw it first." It was playful, but it pricked at him. He raised an eyebrow, slightly annoyed yet intrigued. "Apparently so," he said, trying to sound firm, though the corner of his mouth twitched against a smile. There was a flicker of something unspoken in that exchange, something that went beyond the croissant, beyond politeness. A tension lingered, small but tangible, like static in the air before a storm. As she laughed softly and stepped aside to let him take it, he realized how much he was noticing. The delicate tilt of her head, the way her fingers brushed against the counter ever so lightly, the warmth that seemed to radiate without effort. For a moment, the cafe faded around him. The hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the faint aroma of roasted coffee beans. All of it faded, leaving only the way she moved and the subtle friction of their exchange. Even after she walked away to her table, he caught himself glancing back. His chest had a strange, fluttering weight, part irritation, part fascination. Something about the way she smiled, slightly mischievous, suggested she knew the effect she had on people. Maybe even on him, but she didn't need to prove it. He wasn't sure if he was frustrated or captivated. Maybe both. And the uncertainty gnawed at him in a way he didn't quite understand. This small encounter set the tone. Their connection began with misunderstanding and playful friction, but beneath it was an undeniable spark. Subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make him aware that his life had just shifted slightly. Something was beginning, and neither of them could ignore it. A few days later, he saw her again, this time at the library where he often went to escape the noise of his small apartment. He had hoped for a quiet, solitary afternoon, but fate seemed determined to keep her in his orbit. She was at the far end of the aisle, casually browsing through a row of novels, her fingers trailing lightly along the spines. Even in such an ordinary setting, she carried an air of effortless poise, as if she belonged to a world slightly above the mundane. Their eyes met briefly when he rounded the corner, and for a fraction of a second, he thought he saw surprise, or was it curiosity? The tiny lift of her brow suggested she recognized him from the cafe encounter. A shiver of something unnameable ran down his spine, and he quickly looked away, pretending to study the titles in front of him, though he was acutely aware of her presence just a few meters away. The misunderstanding began innocently enough. She was reaching for the same book he had been holding in mind, a classic he had been planning to check out for weeks. "Oh, I didn't see you there," she said, her voice soft but carrying that same playful edge from before. "I just thought I'd grab this one." He hesitated. Something about her tone struck him the wrong way. Not unpleasant, but teasing in a way that made him defensive. "You thought you'd grab it?" he repeated, trying to keep his irritation in check. "I've been waiting to read that." She tilted her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just didn't realize it was yours." Her words were light, but he couldn't help feeling there was a subtle challenge behind them, a quiet insistence on her own agency. The air between them became charged, not with anger but with unspoken tension. He could feel it in the way her fingers brushed against the edge of the book, in the slight lean of her shoulder as she shifted her weight. Every small movement seemed deliberate, yet effortless, like she knew exactly how to provoke a reaction without saying a word. He caught himself studying the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. Even in mild exasperation, she was captivating. Inside, he wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to snap, to assert that he had a claim, to protect the little corner of his world he'd carved out. But another part, a quieter, more stubborn part, was fascinated by her confidence, her ability to stir something he hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity, tension, and a subtle desire that scared him more than he cared to admit. Finally, he took a deep breath and forced a small smile. "Fine," he said, a little grudgingly, handing the book to her. "Take it. But next time, give me a heads up." Her laugh was soft, genuine, and slightly teasing, and it lingered in his ears long after she walked away. That simple interaction left him with a strange mix of frustration and intrigue, the beginnings of something that felt dangerously like attraction. He couldn't decide if she had misbehaved or if he had misunderstood. Perhaps it was both, and that ambiguity pulled him in ways he wasn't ready to face. It was clear now. Whatever was starting between them wasn't going to be simple, and the tension, both confusing and magnetic, was only going to grow. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic revelation that drew him closer to her. It was something quieter, more subtle, yet infinitely more potent. A few days after the library encounter, they ended up at the same small park, each of them seeking a moment of solitude. He was surprised to see her sitting on a bench beneath the soft shade of a large oak tree, reading a worn journal. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting delicate patterns across her face. She looked up and caught his gaze, giving him a gentle, almost shy smile. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. His chest felt heavier than it should for such a simple question. "Not at all," she said, patting the space beside her. Her warmth was immediate, a quiet invitation that made him acutely aware of his own nervous energy. As he sat down, he noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, a trace of vulnerability behind her composed exterior. The conversation began lightly, about books, coffee, the absurdity of crowded streets, but gradually, it shifted. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke of a personal memory, one tinged with loneliness and quiet regret. It was nothing dramatic, just a story about a missed opportunity, a choice she had made years ago that still lingered in her mind. Yet the honesty in her voice, the soft cadence of her words, made him lean in, listen harder, and care more than he expected. He found himself wanting to reach out, to offer reassurance, but he hesitated, aware of the invisible line between concern and intrusion. He noticed the subtle ways she revealed herself, a flick of her fingers against the journal, the way her eyes occasionally darted away when she grew emotional, the gentle bite of her lip when recalling a tender regret. It was in these small, human gestures that her vulnerability shone, and it drew him closer than any argument or playful tease had before. For his part, he shared some small truths too, moments from his own life that weren't meant to impress, only to explain why he sometimes reacted defensively, why misunderstandings lingered longer than they should. She listened, truly listened, and the way her gaze softened, her hand brushing against his briefly as if to punctuate empathy, left him uncomfortably aware of his own heart. There was a tension between them that wasn't about desire yet. It was about recognition, the realization that they were starting to see each other in ways no one else had. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow across the park, a quiet calm settled between them. He caught himself noting the subtle details, her shoulder brushing his arm as they both laughed softly at a passing dog, the scent of her perfume mingling with the earthy smell of the grass, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. Each small, sensory detail deepened the connection, forging an intimacy that neither confrontation nor flirtation could have achieved alone. When they finally stood to leave, there was a lingering glance, a pause that spoke more than words ever could. He walked away with a mixture of relief and longing, aware that their connection had shifted. The playful friction of earlier encounters had given way to something more profound. A tentative trust, a fragile understanding, and the first unmistakable signs that what had begun as curiosity and tension was evolving into genuine emotional intimacy. By now, their encounters had settled into a rhythm that was both frustrating and intoxicating. Neither of them could deny the pull they felt toward one another, yet both remained acutely aware of the boundaries between curiosity and desire. It was during one of these casual, seemingly mundane meetings that the dynamic between them shifted again, this time toward something lighter, teasing, and unexpectedly intimate. They met at a small art gallery, each wandering through the quiet halls, absorbed in the soft glow of paintings and sculptures. He spotted her across the room, examining a watercolored cityscape, her fingers tracing the faint ridges of the frame as if memorizing every line. He approached slowly, aware of the subtle flutter in his chest, the familiar mix of anticipation and unease. "Still collecting things that aren't yours?" he teased, referencing their earlier library and cafe encounters. His tone was playful, but there was a slight edge of challenge beneath it. She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised, a half-smile tugging at her lips. "And you're still pretending to be the owner of everything you notice first?" she countered, her voice light but filled with a subtle daring. The verbal sparring was effortless, almost like a dance. Words bounced between them, teasing, probing, and revealing glimpses of personality. Each sentence carried double meanings, unspoken acknowledgement of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. He caught himself leaning slightly closer when she laughed, drawn in by the warmth of her presence and the brightness in her eyes. She, in turn, seemed to notice his subtle reactions, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth as if savoring the effect she had on him. There were small, meaningful touches sprinkled throughout the conversation, her fingers brushing his arm as she shifted her weight to face him, the casual nudge of his shoulder against hers when navigating through the narrow gallery aisles. These gestures were fleeting yet loaded with unspoken significance. They were careful, deliberate, and unmistakably intimate, but still entirely appropriate, YouTube-safe gestures that spoke volumes without crossing boundaries. He became hyper-aware of the environment around them, the soft hum of the gallery lights, the faint scent of oil paint and varnish, the subtle warmth radiating from her presence. Every shared glance, every pause, every playful smirk felt amplified in this quiet, private world. Even the silence between them had weight, a language all its own, filled with curiosity and cautious longing. By the time they reached a small corner of the gallery with sunlight streaming through a tall window, there was an almost tangible closeness. She adjusted her scarf and, in doing so, let her fingers brush briefly against his hand. He noticed the slight tremor in his pulse, the warmth that spread across his chest, the awareness of her presence more intensely than ever before. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "You know, this teasing, it's starting to get under my skin." She laughed softly, the sound like a gentle melody that lingered in his ears. "Good," she replied, with a subtle, knowing glint in her eyes. "I like keeping you on your toes." And just like that, their playful tension became a quiet game of push and pull, flirtation wrapped in mutual respect, intelligence, and growing desire. The slow-burn chemistry between them had shifted again, deeper, more intimate, and utterly irresistible. The playful tension that had defined their recent encounters reached its breaking point one late afternoon, in a quiet little cafe where both had sought refuge from the city's unrelenting pace. He arrived first, sipping coffee and letting his thoughts drift, though they inevitably returned to her. When she walked in, the air seemed to shift, the familiar warmth, the subtle flutter of nerves in his chest, and the soft sparkle of anticipation in her eyes. But today, something else lingered, a quiet undercurrent of frustration, a need to address what had been left unspoken. She approached, and their greetings were polite but tight, like strings pulled taut. The conversation started lightly, covering mundane topics. Weather, a new book in the store, the oddity of a shared acquaintance. Yet beneath the surface, the tension simmered, each glance and half-smile carrying an unspoken weight. He could feel it in the way her fingers tapped absent-mindedly against her cup, the slight furrow of her brow, and the way her eyes darted toward him with a mixture of hesitation and expectation. Finally, unable to contain the swirl of emotions inside him, he spoke. "I don't understand," he began, voice calm but edged with frustration. "Sometimes it feels like you misbehave, testing boundaries, but other times, you act as if I'm the one who's misinterpreting everything." She looked at him, her expression softening, though a flicker of defensiveness remained. "I didn't mean to mislead you," she said quietly. "I think you misunderstood me." And just like that, the words hung between them, charged with the weight of weeks of tension. He leaned back slightly, letting the pause stretch, feeling his pulse quicken as he measured his next words. "Misunderstood or not," he said carefully, "some of your actions, they have consequences. They make me question things I didn't expect to feel about someone like you." Her eyes searched his, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. For a moment, there was silence, long enough that the hum of the cafe, the clinking of cups, and the soft chatter of patrons became a backdrop to the intensity of their shared moment. Neither moved, yet both were aware of the subtle pull, the invisible thread that tied them together despite words of frustration and accusation. She started, then paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as if seeking grounding. "I don't want to hurt you," she admitted, her voice low, vulnerable. Sometimes I forget how my actions affect people. Or maybe I'm afraid of being understood too easily." He studied her, seeing her not as a provocateur or a challenge, but as someone deeply human, capable of mistakes and yet wholly captivating. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across the table, letting his hand hover near hers. "I don't want to misunderstand you," he said, voice softer now. "But I can't ignore how it makes me feel either." Their hands brushed, a fleeting but electric contact that conveyed what words could not. It was a moment of truth, where frustration met understanding, where emotional walls began to crumble, and where the connection they had been dancing around finally became undeniable. By the time they parted that afternoon, there was no dramatic resolution, no cinematic declaration, but something profound had shifted. The tension, once playful, had transformed into raw honesty. The push and pull of their slow-burn relationship had reached its emotional peak, leaving them both aware of the vulnerability, desire, and respect that now defined the space between them. After the confrontation, there was a quiet period in their interactions, a gentle, unspoken truce that lingered in the spaces between them. They didn't need to talk constantly, yet every encounter carried a subtle electricity, a sense that the emotional walls between them were gradually coming down. The playful teasing and tension of earlier meetings had evolved into something more delicate, more intimate, yet still unspoken. It was a late afternoon when they found themselves walking together along a tree-lined street, the city's bustle softened by the golden glow of sunset. The air smelled faintly of rain from a passing drizzle, mingling with the earthy warmth of fallen leaves. He noticed the way her coat hugged her shoulders, the soft rustle of fabric as she moved, and the calm confidence in her gait. She, in turn, seemed attuned to his presence, a subtle ease in her steps that mirrored his own. "About the other day," he began, his voice careful, measured. He wasn't sure if this was the right moment, yet the need to bridge the gap was stronger than hesitation. She glanced at him, her expression open, vulnerable yet composed. "I know I could have been clearer," she admitted, her voice quiet, sincere. "I didn't mean to frustrate you. She paused, letting the words linger, as if giving him space to meet her halfway. He felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, the warmth of understanding slowly replacing the flicker of irritation he had carried. "I may have overreacted," he said, his hand brushing briefly against his own coat as if to steady himself. "But I was confused, and I couldn't ignore how it made me feel." The pause between them was soft, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. He took a cautious step closer, not wanting to overwhelm, but unable to resist the subtle pull that had been growing between them. She didn't flinch. Instead, She allowed herself to share the space, their proximity a quiet acknowledgement of trust and connection. When he finally reached out, his hand lightly touched hers, fingertips brushing against the warmth of her skin. It was not a bold gesture, but it carried weight, an unspoken promise, a tentative offering of understanding. She responded, her fingers lingering over his, a soft smile touching her lips. The physical contact, gentle and fleeting, mirrored the emotional closeness that had been building over weeks. As they walked in silence, the world around them seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them and the delicate rhythm of shared presence. He noticed the way her hair caught the light, the slight tilt of her head as she looked toward him, and the quiet grace in her movements. Each detail deepened the sense of intimacy, revealing a bond that transcended words. By the time they parted that evening, there was a sense of resolution, a shared understanding that mistakes and misunderstandings did not diminish their connection. The push and pull of frustration and attraction had transformed into a tender, mutual respect. Their slow-burn relationship had shifted into a space of trust, where vulnerability was met with empathy, and closeness was allowed to grow naturally. For him, the lingering warmth of her hand on his, the soft brush of her gaze, and the quiet rhythm of their shared space left a lasting impression. They were no longer simply two individuals dancing around tension and desire. They were companions in emotional exploration, each learning to navigate the fragile yet exhilarating terrain of trust, understanding, and burgeoning intimacy. The weeks following their reconciliation were quieter, yet heavier with meaning. Their connection had settled into a rhythm that was both comfortable and charged, each interaction carrying the weight of understanding, attraction, and subtle, unspoken desire. They didn't rush to define it. There was no need for grand declarations, but every glance, every small touch, and every shared smile was a reaffirmation of the bond that had grown between them. It was late afternoon when they met at a small riverside park, a favorite spot they had discovered together in moments of quiet reflection. The sun cast long, golden reflections across the rippling water, and the air was cool with the lingering warmth of a day well lived. He noticed the way she paused at the water's edge, her fingers lightly brushing against the railing as she leaned slightly forward, lost in thought. There was a calm elegance in her stance, yet he sensed the same quiet tension that had always drawn him in, the push and pull of caution and curiosity, restraint and longing. "Do you ever wonder if things could be different?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a hint of vulnerability. He turned to her, meeting her gaze, and saw the flicker of hope she tried to mask behind a composed exterior. He considered her words carefully. The truth was simple, yet powerful. Every moment with her had shifted something inside him. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady but warm, but different in the right ways. He stepped closer, their proximity familiar yet deliberate. "We've navigated a lot already. Maybe it's time we stop holding back." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw the subtle relief in her expression. The acknowledgement that their feelings were mutual, that the tension, the teasing, and the careful distance had all led to this quiet understanding. She smiled, small but genuine, and let her hand brush against his as they walked along the riverbank. The touch was brief, unforced, yet it carried the accumulated weight of weeks of hesitation, frustration, and unspoken attraction. They paused on a small wooden bridge, watching the water shimmer in the fading sunlight. Neither spoke for a moment, letting the stillness and the shared presence communicate what words could not. Then, gently, he reached out and took her hand, holding it with careful certainty. She didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with his, a subtle acknowledgement of trust, closeness, and affection. "I'm glad we didn't let misunderstandings define us," he said, his tone soft but sincere. "Me too," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet weight of experience and emotion. "It's rare to feel understood without everything needing to be perfect." In that moment, they both understood the depth of what had grown between them. The slow burn, the teasing, the misunderstandings, and the tender reconciliations had forged something meaningful. A connection that was intimate, respectful, and profoundly human. They didn't need a grand gesture or an elaborate declaration. The quiet intertwining of their hands, the lingering glances, and the soft smiles were enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, they walked together along the river, side by side. The world around them was calm, yet within the quiet closeness, there was a warmth, a security, and a promise of something lasting. Whether their future held certainty or uncertainty, they had reached a place of emotional resolution, a space where understanding, affection, and trust were enough to carry them forward. The slow burn had reached its full bloom. Two souls, once entangled in misunderstanding, now standing together, quietly, deeply, and undeniably connected. 22.